January 15, 2019 was a day forever ingrained for Kenyans. Locals and guests of the Dusit D2 Hotel in the capital Nairobi saw their lives flashing before their eyes as a terror attack executed by the Al-Shabaab terrorist group took place. The group began to rain fire on the hotel as hundreds of rounds sprayed across, killing over a dozen citizens and injuring several more. Bombs thrown by the terrorists engulfed the hotel complex in flames, and the cries of the people echoed through the city. But in spite of this horrific episode, one SAS operator, Christian Craighead, took matters into his own hands. Craighead became an unstoppable force, hell-bent on destroying terrorists who stood in his way. While the city of Nairobi was forced to navigate the horror and uncertainty of how this siege would unfold.
When I came out, I just saw a lot of smoke.
Two guys, fully armored, shooting at the restaurant.
Because they started outside, they come shooting people.
This is the Nairobi Hotel Siege. Kenya is a country that attracts millions of tourists all over the globe due to its rich cultural heritage, wilderness, and safaris. The country was blessed with the potential to be the greatest in East Africa, but that potential was wasted as many parts of the country were corrupted by unstable political systems, poverty, and inequality among the locals, creating the perfect sandstorms for a soon impending doom. Increasing the crime rate in the cities that were impoverished and housed people who were victims of the corrupt system, Kenya's population consisted of 85% Christians and 11% Muslims who were destined to live in harmony. But over the years, they began to develop a sense of hatred for each other as the country saw a rise in terror attacks executed by the notorious terror group Al-Shabaab. But the terrorists didn't originate from Kenya, as the country shares its borders with Somalia, who were facing domestic challenges of their own. The state of Somalia was suffering from infestation of terrorist groups and their dominance over the region. Al-Shabaab came into fruition in 2006 and began recruiting the locals by broadcasting their opposing views about the Ethiopian invasion and how the elites of Somalia had taken advantage of the poor, depriving them of basic necessities. Emotional manipulation was a part of Al-Shabaab's recruitment strategy, which was proven fruitful as an uptick was seen in the number of young recruits. The group rapidly grew from a few hundred to several thousands and soon became a well-organized militia, threatening the Somalian political framework and attempting to take control over the region by any means necessary. But Somalia wasn't the only country that was crumbling from within, as its neighbors were soon going to suffer the same fate, as the terrorist group took every advantage they could in order to grow their influence in Kenya as well. This included exploiting the exposed Kenyan border, from where they conducted cross-border attacks, sent recruitment agents, and established dominance over Kenyan villages that were defenseless against the large manpower of the terrorists. The Al-Shabaab had a strong presence online and often implemented recruitment strategies that took advantage of the grievances many people from the Third World shared. Among those people were Kenyan Muslims who felt oppressed by their government officials and demanded justice from a system that made them feel invisible, making them the perfect candidates for the Al-Shabaab to manipulate and corrupt. The cancer of Somalia began spreading in Kenya as Al-Shabaab started to recruit more individuals from the region and grew even larger than before. As days went by, the number of Muslim minorities grew tenfold, some joining with the hope of bringing about a change in their cruel lands. But little did they know that they were just pawns in a war with no end in sight. Less than 4 years later, in 2010, the Al-Shabaab gained new heights of power as they began executing strategies to overthrow the Somali government. Their advances initiated a civil war that resulted in the terrorists gaining even more control in a larger area within the already war-torn region. The group won the people over with their promise of making Somalia great again and formed an administration to govern the terrorists that it had under its rule. The people's eyes lit up like stars as they were finally getting the feeling that their home would return to greatness. But the promise fell far short as it came at the cost of many innocent lives being slaughtered, leaving behind no one to oppose the terrorists' unjustified rule. The Somali terrorists became a bigger threat than anyone could have anticipated and even formed links with al-Qaeda, making them an unavoidable threat that had the potential of trampling over governments and destroying the political framework of countries. The devastation caused by the terrorists in Somalia and their rising influence in Kenya provoked the neighboring African countries to partner up with Somali military forces to eradicate the al-Shabaab from their homes. In order to fight back against the militia, the United States and the United Kingdom began funding the allied African forces, equipping the locals with the ammunition and weaponry to fend off against the militia. For added measure, the Kenyan and Ethiopian forces received training from members of the United States Green Beret and the United Kingdom Special Air Service. With their new arsenal and training, the Allied forces rushed into Somalia to restore order in the war-torn state and put the terrorists back in their place. And later initiating the Battle of Mogadishu, the war lasted for a year, and with each passing month, the al-Shabaab kept losing more terrorists, while soldiers of the Allied forces increased to 9,000, eventually forcing al-Shabaab to announce a strategic withdrawal from Mogadishu by August of 2011. But the terrorists didn't back down that easily, as they continued their guerrilla attacks on the Allied forces and the civilians of Somalia. As 2011 was coming to an end, so was the reign of terror in Somalia. In October and November of the same year, the al-Shabaab lost their strongholds and went into hiding, plotting their next moves, while on the other hand, the Allied forces continued their efforts towards restoring peace in Somalia and took back the cities of Baidoa and Kismayo in 2012. As the dust settled, the victory in Somalia was nothing to celebrate. The war against al-Shabaab led to thousands of innocent lives being viciously slaughtered, with many unfortunate souls being caught in the crossfire and hundreds of homes being destroyed by the endless bombings. A place that was once called paradise by hundreds of residents for years turned into rubble in a matter of seconds. The Allied forces won the battle against al-Shabaab, but the war had just begun as something more sinister was brewing in the shadows by the terrorist group leaders. After facing defeat against the African Allied forces, the al-Shabaab learned that going against the government is only going to bring more trouble their way and face inevitable defeat. But by targeting smaller, unprotected societies, they can spread more chaos and get away with their crimes. During their hiding, the terrorist group began restructuring their warfare strategies and opted for a more asymmetric conflict approach, which involved the terrorists going up against civilians and low-level security forces instead of the country's military. The al-Shabaab still had influence in some parts of Somalia, which they took advantage of and began their recruitment process once again, this time being more cautious and avoiding any unwanted attention from the local authorities. The new warfare approach proved to be effective for the terrorists, as their mission of destruction and chaos was being successfully executed in Kenya and Somalia, increasing the civilian casualty count to deplorable levels. In October of 2017, the al-Shabaab targeted a secure compound that housed local agencies and Somali troops, planning to blow up the compound as a display of power. In order to do so, the terrorists equipped 3 trucks with deadly explosives and unleashed them into Mogadishu city, expecting a heavy casualty count from the collision of the trucks into the compound. During their heinous operation, one of the trucks attracted the attention of security forces and was chased down through the city, ensuring a high-speed chase that ended with the truck crashing into a hotel barrier and exploded in the Holden district. The explosion from the first truck led to deaths of 587 people, leaving 316 severely injured. But the tragedy was not yet over, as the 2 other trucks exploded near the first truck's vicinity, killing 2 more civilians in the process. The 2017 Mogadishu bombings were one of the most horrific events of terrorism in African history and showcased the cruelty of the al-Shabaab, making them one of the most notorious terrorist groups on the continent. Since their resurgence, the al-Shabaab continued their acts of atrocities, which included kidnapping civilians, slaughtering local Christian residents, public executions and bombings, amassing a casualty count of more than 3,000 since their inception, and filling the streets of both Kenya and Somalia with lead and blood. After realizing that there was no end in sight to the chaos, the African Allied forces began doubling down on training and tightening the security around their borders. Throughout the years, neighboring countries like Kenya and Ethiopia kept receiving foreign funds and professional military trainers, which trained the local military and security forces to defend themselves against the terrorists. Among the professional trainers was Christian Craighead, an SAS operator who spent more than 25 years in service. Little did anyone know that this SAS operator was soon going to become a valuable asset to the Kenyan forces and al-Shabaab's greatest threat. In 1992, Christian Craighead joined the British military at the age of 16 and dedicated himself to protecting his country. As time went on, Craighead kept on climbing the ranks in the military and became an exceptional member of his unit. In a span of a few years, he went from being a junior paratrooper to a seasoned pathfinder, which allowed him to lead his own reconnaissance team during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Craighead was known for his sense of leadership and serving a greater purpose, which encouraged him to apply for the Special Air Service Selection Program, which was known to be one of the most difficult and rigorous programs in the United Kingdom. But Craighead was determined to serve his country and conquer the challenges that life threw at him. After spending 6 agonizing months in training and completing the courses of the program, Christian was selected to join the SAS regiment. Once he became an SAS operator, his information remained confidential, a common practice used by secret operators to maintain confidentiality. By looking into history of this top-secret regiment, it was clear that Christian had been involved in missions that were based on counterterrorism and unconventional warfare. The SAS was known for its secrecy and precision, conducting international missions that focused on maintaining international peace, rescuing hostages, and eliminating threats that had the potential to ruin the political framework of a specific country. Members of the SAS were silent but deadly, leaving no stone unturned and no cry unheard. Those who got on their hit list did not live to tell the tale, making the SAS operators the real-life boogeymen. Records do reveal that Christian was part of the Tier 1 unit of the 22nd SAS Regiment and was assigned to conduct training programs for the Kenyan military forces as a means to prepare them against the forces of al-Shabaab. The SAS operator had developed a sense of responsibility for equipping the Kenyan forces with the knowledge and skills to protect themselves and those they loved. As the war on terror continued in Kenya and Somalia, Christian kept on training the local military forces and spent the rest of his days living among the Kenyans. But soon, an unavoidable tragedy was going to force the SAS operator to enter the field and take matters into his own hands. As the year 2018 was coming to an end, the al-Shabaab had stayed dormant for far too long and decided to execute another devastating operation that had the potential to risk the lives of hundreds of innocent civilians. With that in mind, the terrorists targeted the 14 Riverside Drive complex in the Westlands of Nairobi. This particular complex consisted of business offices of well-known brands, high-end restaurants, and the luxurious Dusit D2 hotel, making it the perfect place for the terrorists to incite fear in the hearts of Kenyan residents and business tycoons. According to their plan, a group of 7 terrorists were going to force their way into the business complex from the front gate and throw bombs at civilian vehicles, trapping them inside the complex while destroying as much infrastructure as they possibly could until the local authorities arrived. After the initial plan was made, the al-Shabaab sent several men to do reconnaissance missions, who reported back to their leaders, notifying them about the loose security protocols that the complex was following, giving the terrorists an opportunity to easily infiltrate the area. The goal of the terrorists was to amass a casualty count that was higher than their previous operations and assert dominance in the heart of Kenya by burning everything to the ground. On January 15, 2019, the al-Shabaab began executing their operation at 2:30 in the afternoon, during which a group of terrorists arrived near the business complex in 2 vehicles and marched towards the front gate on foot. Upon arrival, the culprits shot 2 security guards that were posted near the front gate of the business complex and started their spree of chaos. The armed men started to open fire on innocent civilians and the security guards that stood outside the business office. One of the culprits, while wearing a suicide bomber vest, entered the secret Garden Dusit restaurant and blew himself up, turning the building into rubble and fatally injuring dozens of civilians. The remaining terrorists continued their rampage and gunned down anyone who came in their line of sight, while throwing grenades in the parking lot near the business office. In a state of panic, the civilians began rushing towards the exits of the complex. But due to the threat of being shot by the terrorists on their way out, some remained indoors and barricaded themselves in their offices and hotel rooms. A place where people enjoyed their meals and spent time with their families during the holidays became a bloodbath where no one was safe from the wrath of the terrorists. As the chaos continued, the Anti-Terrorism Division of the Kenyan Police Force was sent to evacuate the citizens that were trapped inside the complex and neutralize the threat. The terrorists and local authorities began exchanging gunfire, turning the luxurious streets of the complex into an active war zone. After being overwhelmed by the power of the security forces, the terrorists began taking refuge inside the Dusit D2 hotel, keeping the hotel guests as hostages and holding defensive positions in the upper floor executive suites. As local authorities were planning out ways to rescue the hostages from the hotel, many trapped civilians began sending out messages on social media expressing their dying wishes and begging for help. When all hope seemed lost, one call for backup was going to save the lives of hundreds, and that call was answered by none other than SAS operator Christian Craighead himself. As time went on, the exchange of gunfire between the Kenyan security forces and the Al-Shabaab terrorists kept getting more intense by the minute. With innocent lives on the line and no time to waste, a call for backup was made by a security force member to a Ministry of Defense official in the United Kingdom, who later contacted Christian Craighead and notified him about the situation in the hotel. Without hesitation, the off-duty SAS operator packed up his arsenal and headed toward the business complex, ready to put the terrorists back into their place. Upon arriving at the scene of the battle, Christian equipped himself with a Colt Canada C8 assault rifle, a Glock 17 pistol, and a combat knife, while wearing a balaclava on his face to hide his identity. After meeting up with the security forces, Christian initiated a coordinated attack with the local authorities and began his mission of rescuing the hostages. The SAS operator entered the building and cleaned house by going door to door, thoroughly checking every corner and safely escorting the hostages out. One floor after the other, Christian repeated the process multiple times until he was confronted by two terrorists on the upper floors. Both parties began exchanging rounds, but due to the SAS operator's decades of experience and determination to stop the bloodshed, Christian dominated the terrorists and took both of them down. Meanwhile, the brave members of the Kenyan forces secured the remaining hostages and shot two other terrorists that were hiding on different floors of the building. As the sun began setting in the west, things died down for a moment, which made local authorities assume that the threat had become successfully neutralized. But around the early hours of January 16th, bullets and grenades began raining from above, starting the battle once again. This time, with the security forces having the upper hand and successfully taking down the two remaining gunmen hidden inside the hotel rooms, ending the 19-hour standoff once and for all.
And now we go to Kenya, where more than a dozen people have been killed in a terror attack there.
We're going to try and follow them as far as we can, keeping in mind that the situation is still live. We can still hear gunfire.
I had a big blast, then a lot of shootout. Then I wrote messages to people and told them there is very heavy shootout. Before I could think, they were hitting doors just around me.
After the standoff concluded, it was revealed that the attack on the business complex led to the deaths of 22 innocent civilians, leaving 28 severely injured. But the devastation would have taken more lives if it weren't for the bravery of Christian Craighead and the Kenyan security forces, who intervened in the terrorist operation with precision and determination. A year later, Christian was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross, which is known to be the second highest military decoration in the British Armed Forces. But Christian began facing some problems online as his personal information and face were blurred out while the incident was mentioned in the mainstream. This created an ongoing for impersonators to take credit for Christian's efforts and put his image at risk. Before things could take a turn for the worse, Christian decided to break the SAS protocol and reveal his true identity by showing unblurred photos of himself while rescuing the hostages and telling his story on podcasts. The SAS higher-ups were displeased by Christian's actions and provoked the hero to resign from the force.
I unlocked some sort of superpower on that day. I could hear things, I could move faster, I was stronger. I'd have similar incidents before my military career, but on that day...
As for Kenya and its neighboring countries, the war on terror still continues, with many innocent civilian lives being lost on a monthly basis. But the efforts of heroes like Christian Craighead and the Kenyan security forces have become role models for the public, encouraging them from all over the globe to take a stand against the atrocities of terrorists like Al-Shabaab and dedicate their lives protecting innocent civilians. The constant resistance against the terrorists by the brave men and women in the African security forces has proven that the terrorists may break the people's hopes and dreams, but it can never break their fighting spirit. After deep diving into the history of the Dusit D2 hotel complex attack, we wonder, how would have things turned out if Christian wasn't in Kenya during the shootout? And will African countries ever get rid of Al-Shabaab and other terrorist groups?